I endured years of humiliation as the backbone of the family, but the day they thought I was vulnerable, they stabbed me in the back by presenting forged powers of attorney and a so-called family settlement at my community gala, trying to steal the buildings my grandmother hid for us. I held my breath and smiled. They had no idea I'd been listening to every whisper, scanning every filing, and protecting a legal web my grandmother built. I'm about to let them fall into it, gently and perfectly. My name is Maya Johnson, and I am 39 years old. Before I reveal exactly how I walked away with everything, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you believe toxic people always get what they deserve. But to understand how they ended up with absolutely nothing, we have to go back to how my quiet power was born. People in our family thought I was kind by nature and meek by choice. I learned early the power of letting others perform their drama while I built the foundation. My grandmother Lillian Mae Johnson didn't leave us a flashy inheritance. She left what she called freedom work, a trust stitched into church deeds, barbershop leases, and storefronts, recorded under little-known nonprofit names and a handful of shell LLCs. The Aunt Lillian Freedom Trust wasn't about riches for show. It was quiet land that kept paying rent year after year, a slow, steady answer to our prayers. I was the sole living trustee because Lillian trusted me to keep the promise. To my sister Simone and her children, I was the woman with old-fashioned morals and time to hand out thrift store scarves at family reunions. I answered to Maya the peacemaker. I cooked for holidays, held the family Bible, drove kids to auditions, co-signed car loans, and sat through endless lectures about how I didn't know brand names and shouldn't dress like that for important people. They mixed classless insults into cocktail napkins and swallowed them with wine. Simone always pressed flawless nails, Hermes knockoffs that cost more than her mortgage, would pat my arm and call me simple while sliding an Uber Eats receipt across the kitchen that she'd never pay. What they didn't see was the late-night light under my kitchen cabinet where I kept my laptop. After everyone slept and the house settled, I would cross-check county records against my grandmother's ledger, reconcile accounting entries, and draft amendments. I was a restorative land custodian by trade, a background no one knew about because I didn't want the land to become a spectacle. My work involved quiet title actions, managing certificate of trust filings, negotiating with small business tenants, and most importantly, keeping the trust's chain of title untangled so no developer or greedy relative could find a foothold. They called my security simply stubbornness. They called my boundaries stubborn. When my sister asked for money, I gave what I could, more than I should have, because family is supposed to be fed. When Tamika, my niece, started bringing home expensive handbags and showing up late with champagne, I paid their late mortgage sometimes just to stop the screaming and keep the family image intact. They built an illusion of high society on the bones of our trust's cash flow. They wore brands like armor while balancing payment plans on the backs of my checkbook. Inside, I prayed. I whispered to Lillian in the quiet of the night that the rest of us couldn't continue to treat us like welfare recipients of her labor. I tested their loyalty by letting them in. They mistook that for weakness. They believed my silence was the same as consent. The plan was almost comically theatrical. It began with Tamika's pop-up blessing idea over coffee. Aunt Maya, we should do something to honor the family business with a ceremonial signature. People will love the story. Simone loved stories. Simone loved crowds. A Juneteenth gala at the theater, one of the old trust properties, was the perfect backdrop. They envisioned a video, Simone in a couture dress, Tamika with a microphone, my name reduced to a ceremonial ribbon cutting. The goal? Get me to sign administrative convenience paperwork under emotional duress in front of the community, then feed that signed page to a county recorder who would accept it as an amendment. But the scheme had a sinister twist. Tameka had already, in secret, hired a notary she'd befriended at the city bank, someone who owed favors and took cash for arrangements. They drafted a power of administrative consent, that looked harmless but contained a clause transferring signature authority for specific parcels to an LLC they formed, L&C Redevelopment. The LLC's operating agreement was another paper tiger, filled with promises they knew they'd never keep to tenants. There was also a family settlement agreement that, if filed, would attempt to quiet any title objections by calling my authority derivative rather than primary. The real theft was subtler. They planned to sell or refinance storefronts at weekend auctions, quietly siphon rent, and then claim that since Maya had approved the admin paperwork at a family event, they had the moral high ground. Simone thought the show would provide cover. Who would question someone performing a public blessing? Tamika and her partner Lamar thought they could slip in bank access by forging canceled checks and forging my electronic signature on a loan modification. They even rehearsed how to humiliate me. I would be called up to seal the blessing and asked to sign. They imagined cameras, speeches, and my smile being turned into a viral clip that justified their actions. Entitlement can make people creative in their cruelty. They were sure their debts would be wiped and their image polished. They were wrong about one thing. I never signed anything I didn't already own. At the kitchen table across from them weeks before, I watched the plan through a polite smile while they rehearsed lines about community revitalization and paying back the elders. They treated my silence like a napkin you wipe off your hands. They thought the trust's assets were a communal ATM that never dried up. The audacity of asking me, the trustee, to bless their theft in public was the moment they stopped hiding and started howling. When I first saw the mock-up of the administrative convenience form, my chest went cold. I recognized the legalese. I recognized the loophole. I recognized their panic hope, where greed meets improvisation. So I stopped being afraid. Instead of confronting them at the coffee shop where their cameras were set to roll, I did the work I always do. I went home, made coffee, and began building a paper fortress. At 2 a.m., I filed an affidavit of forgery for the notary's name once I discovered she'd notarized a prior phony document. I pulled every recorded deed for the trust properties across 3 counties and cross-referenced them against Lillian May's original trust instrument. I recorded a certificate of trust with the county recorder's office that legally established my sole trusteeship and included a restrictive covenant Lillian had insisted on. No transfer or assignment of the trust's beneficial interest without the trustee's notarized, certified, and recorded consent, a requirement the scam could not meet. I also prepared more muscular tools, a quiet title action that I sealed with evidence of decades of peaceful possession, an assignment of rents notice recorded against the LLCs the kids had set up, and a UCC1 financing statement attached to the operating account they used for L&C redevelopment. The UCC1 was strategic. By recording it against the LLC's accounts, any lender or buyer would see a clouded title, making any immediate refinancing or sale impossible without resolving the lien in court. I sent a demand letter to the notary and to the title company they'd planned to use, notifying them of suspected fraud and asking them to refuse any instruments. I drafted a temporary restraining order application and had a local pro bono judge, a woman I knew from work who respected the history of Lillian May, agree to read an emergency motion if I filed it. I also prepped eviction notices and writs of possession for any unit they tried to flip without authorization, engaging a county marshal on a standby basis. The marshal needed cause. My filings would give it. Crucially, I did not go to war with shouting. I let my paperwork be the gun on the table. I ordered certified copies of every deed and had them bound in a book I called Lillian's Ledger. I had an auditor run an out-of-cycle audit on the trust accounts and get me signed affidavits showing every penny the trust had paid in rents for the last 10 years. That audit would be crucial in 2 ways: to demonstrate the trust's ongoing operation and to expose any diverted funds if the kids tried to launder rent through the LLC. I also arranged a seemingly spiritual support. I asked Pastor Keisha, who ran the community center and had hosted the trust's tenants for years, to bless the theater at the Juneteenth Freedom Gala and to stand beside me. Pastor Keisha was sharp. She had seen property vultures before. When I told her I planned to reveal some truths that night, she said, "Maya, show them the law and address. Give them the gospel and the deed." She smiled and agreed. While I worked in the quiet, I watched them build the stage set for their theft. I downloaded their email strings from a device that had been left open at a family meeting. I confronted a few of those people privately, threatening to produce the emails if they assisted any fraudulent filing. The pressure made a few of them step back. In legal terms, I converted my spiritual patience into equity weapons. Trust law is a textbook for quiet avengers: certificates of trust, restrictions on alienation, assignments of rents, recording priority, and quiet title actions. I used them all. And before that Juneteenth night, I filed preemptive motions and recorded notices. I selected my moment carefully. The Freedom Gala was everything they thought it would be: gowns, a gospel quartet that sang like prayer, and Simone glowing under stage lights. The theater was full: church ladies in pearls, small business owners, the alderman, a reporter from the local paper. The room smelled like fried fish and perfume. It felt like home. Simone had choreographed the moment where she would announce a community reinvestment plan and present me the honorary seal to sign the administrative form. Cameras were on. Tameka had her microphone and an entourage that drank like royalty. I wore a simple black dress and a strand of my grandmother's beads. Maya the peacemaker looked like a church queen that night, no designer label necessary. Pastor Keisha called me up, and the choir sang a hymn that Lillian used to hum. I let them lead the ritual part. I smiled when Simone handed me a document on stage, the one they'd prepared, confident and smug. But instead of taking the pen, I unfolded my book, Lillian's ledger, bound with the auditor's cover letter and certified copies of county records. I cleared my throat and, in a calm voice loud enough for the entire auditorium, said, "This is the chain of title for our theater, our storefronts, and the barber next door. Each of these deeds is recorded. Each of these tenants has a lease, and each of these rents goes into the trust account that my grandmother started." A hush fell. I handed the ledger to the reporter in the front row and said, "If anyone here thinks those documents are anything but theft, please stand by to explain why they recorded an LLC and signed a forged power of attorney." I then asked the theater manager to project a simple slide on the screen: the county recorder's stamp of my certificate of trust filed 2 weeks prior, the date and time, the recorder's ID. I watched the color drain from Simone's face. Then I read slowly the affidavit of forgery where the notary's passport photograph sat beside a signed denial she had emailed the title company. Tameka's mouth moved. She started to pull something from her clutch. I kept reading. "I will also read for you the UCC-1 financing statement recorded this morning against L&C Redevelopment," I said. "Their operating account is now encumbered. I have filed a quiet title action in county court. I have served notices of assignment of rents. And Pastor Keisha, you might want to step forward because I also have here a writ of possession scheduled for immediate execution. Sheriff Carter is on standby." It felt like someone had opened all the curtains. The auditorium's chatter swelled and then fell into a pin-drop silence so complete you could hear pearls shift on a neck. Simone laughed a thin laugh that sounded like a cracked bell. "Maya, what is this?" she hissed. I turned to her and spoke softly, the voice of a woman who had been 1,000 small humiliations and now wore them like armor. "You set out to sell our properties on the cheap to rebrand my grandmother's work as your vision. You forged papers. You solicited a notary. And you stood here to make a spectacle of my consent." I did not raise my voice. I didn't have to. Tameka, who had rehearsed her viral lines, looked at the pages I held and then at the theater doors. From behind the stage, 2 uniformed deputies stepped into view. They had come to serve papers, serving civil process is public, and the marshal had agreed to be present should I need a writ executed. Someone in the front row whispered, "Is that the sheriff?" Simone lunged for the microphone, trying to shout a counter-accusation. "You gave them money. You co-signed," she started. I raised my hand and said, "I gave help. I did not give away sovereign trusteeship. There is a difference." Then I read 2 lines from the trust instrument. Lillian May had written a clause forbidding any transfer without the trustee's certified, recorded signature. I turned to the audience and said, "Whatever you thought this night was going to be, this will not be that. This night will be truth." The camera panned. The local reporter, who'd known Lillian all his life, stepped up and asked to see the audit. I handed him a copy. The choir did not sing. The people who had been there to celebrate watched as we transformed the gala into a hearing. Simone screamed then, not a theatrical exclamation, but a raw thing. "You cannot do this!" She lunged, tried to grab a paper from my hands. A deputy gently restrained her. Temeka begged the crowd, "They don't understand. This will bring jobs." Someone in the back muttered, "This is family business." I turned to Pastor Keisha and spoke. "Pastor, I asked for your blessing not so this family could be praised for its theft. Let's pray." Pastor Keisha's voice rose and the hymn started again, but it was not the prayer for a ribbon cutting. It was a prayer for accountability. The tension in the room shifted. My legal filings had not only clouded the title, they had stripped their performance of all cover. The climax was therapeutic and merciless in its logic. The sheriff's deputy handed Simone a certified copy of the quiet title complaint and a notice that an emergency hearing on the UCC lien and assignment of rents would occur on Monday. That morning, the county recorder had also flagged the forged instruments as under investigation in a criminal affidavit I had filed. The fraud unit would follow up. Temeka's fiancé, Lamar, who had been bold enough to stand beside her, paled when he realized lenders wouldn't underwrite a sale with a UCC on record. No shouting from me, only the slow ritual of reading names, dates, and entries that made criminality visible to everyone. In about 20 minutes, the narrative they had rehearsed for weeks, the one where I was a silly aunt who didn't know the law, was dismantled. The public atmosphere had turned on them like a mirror. The crowd that had come to applaud them now watched them as if they were a bad television show. Simone, undone, fell to her knees. The theater's hum turned to whisper as reporters took notes. The hand that once smoothed her designer scarf trembled. She begged, not for forgiveness, but for mints and brow-beating glances. I stood and felt no rush of triumph, only a profound, quiet relief. The ledger in my hand was the answer my grandmother had made me keep, and I had used it like a sacrament. After the deputies left with their service copies and the reporter asked me for a sit-down interview, the family tried a flurry of small theatrical apologies. Temeka cried big, exhausted sobs and spoke of how they'd always felt desperate and believed they'd be saved by a quick sale. Marcus, the nephew who'd been bossed by debt collectors, offered to sign a public retraction. Simone demanded private negotiation and cash settlements. Lamar begged me on his knees in the supper hall later that week, hands out like a boy asking for a favor. I had already calculated the damages. The audit had numbers, the UCC and quiet title had legal weight. I chose the path my grandmother would have honored: accountability, restoration for tenants, and protection of the land for future generations. I told them there was no private negotiation. The public record had to stand. If they wanted to come clean, they could cooperate with the fraud investigation. If they refused, the trust would pursue every civil remedy available. They begged. They tried to bargain. Simone offered me her stocks. Temeka promised to start a nonprofit. The bargaining chips were as small as their consciences. I signed none of it. Instead, I signed a piece of my own future. I restructured the trust's protective covenants and signed new beneficiary directives that emphasized long-term stewardship. tenant first leases, anti-speculation clauses, and an internal audit committee. I executed NDAs, not as a gag to hide truth, but to protect sensitive tenant information and to allow the community properties to breathe free of gossip while we stabilized them. I put management of the cafe and the barbershop into a cooperative structure, offering training and profit share agreements to the building staff rather than handing keys to people who would sell the soul of the neighborhood. Simone and her children had to look at the ledger and see that their brand of entitlement had consequences. They faced civil suits and the criminal fraud investigation for the forged notary. The community demanded restitution for the stress and deception. The Trust's board, small, composed of longtime tenants and elders, voted to exclude any family member who participated in the fraud from trustee consideration for 10 years. That action did not feel vindictive. It felt necessary. We were breaking a pattern where family trauma fed entitlement. I moved out of the old house 2 months later, not because I didn't want to be around the people I loved, but because the space had become a battleground. I rented a quiet apartment near the river where Lillian used to walk and pray. There, morning light on the water felt like a liturgy. I kept visiting the properties to speak with tenants, to make sure the management cooperatives were functioning, and to teach a basic class about record-keeping and rights at the community center. That was a salve that did more for my soul than any courtroom victory. Spiritually, I did something small and radical. I let go. Part of our legacy had been the loneliness of always giving and never protecting. I learned to set a boundary that included both love and accountability. I started meeting weekly with a small circle of women, folks who had lost houses, who had been lied about, who had been made invisible. We talked about money, about prayer, about how to read a deed. We fed each other spiritually and practically. When I walked into those sessions, I was no longer the one who merely absorbed the family's friction. I was the one teaching the younger women how to avoid the traps I had been forced to navigate. Months after the gala, Simone called me. Her voice was thin. She had a court date to face legal consequences for the notarized documents. I listened. I did not offer legal mercy. I offered a plan. She could volunteer to teach financial literacy at the center as part of restitution. It was the kind of accountability that would do more good than money, the conversion of harm into service. Simone agreed reluctantly. Her brand new rebuilding began with sweeping floors at the community center under my supervision. As for Tamika, she chose to go to a restorative justice program. Lamar enrolled in a trade apprenticeship. They worked to repair harm the only way it could be repaired, by learning to be stewards rather than takers. Some reconciliations were public and messy. Others were private and slow. The trust remained intact. Lillian May's ledger sat, now less as a weapon and more as a scripture of stewardship. On quiet nights, I still lift my grandmother's beads and feel the pull of responsibility. I also sleep now. I lock my office at 10 p.m. and go to bed without the old compulsion to be everything to everyone. Breaking the generational curse didn't mean isolation. It meant teaching the next generation what stewardship looks like, a mixture of law, prayer, and clear boundaries. If you are listening and you have been the backbone of a family, remember, your sacrifice is noble, but it does not entitle others to take. Protect the work you inherit, record it, certify it, and if necessary, litigate it. And when the moment comes to confront them, do it with the elegance of a woman who learned how to read deeds at midnight and call the sheriff at dawn. I didn't shout. I didn't break down on stage. I used the law and my grandmother's wisdom like a shield and a scalpel. In that, there was peace. If this story spoke to you, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. Share if you know what it is to be the silent keeper who finally chooses herself. And remember, protect your peace, protect your paper, and never underestimate the quiet woman who holds a ledger.